I'm Tori Brennan, and I'm 29 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my father stood up in front of 30 relatives and grounded me like a disobedient child because I dared to ask what my grandmother had left me in her will. The entire room laughed. My face burned so hot I could feel my pulse in my teeth. I looked him dead in the eye and said one word, "All right." The next morning, he knocked on my bedroom door, smirking. "Finally learned your place," he said. Then he saw the empty room. No clothes, no suitcase, no me. Before he could dial my number, the doorbell rang. The family lawyer was standing on the porch, trembling, holding a briefcase full of documents my father never knew existed. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "what have you done?" "Let me take you back to September, the morning my grandmother died. Eleanor Brennan passed on a Tuesday at Providence Portland Medical Center. She was 87. I got the call at 6:14 a.m. I was already awake at my drafting table sketching a rain garden for a client. My mother's voice was thin as tissue paper held to light. "It's Grandma, Tori. She's gone." I drove to the hospital in silence. When I arrived, my father was already in the hallway. Richard Brennan, 63, retired state judge, wearing a waxed barber jacket, on his phone discussing probate schedules. My brother Garrett stood beside him in a dark suit, arm looped around Dad's shoulder like a running mate at a campaign stop. They looked like a wall. I stood at the far end of the corridor alone, clutching a paper cup of vending machine coffee I never drink. The last time I'd seen Grandma Eleanor, she'd gripped my hand in the garden of her house on Hawthorne Street. "Tori," she'd said, voice low. "I've taken care of things. Trust me." I'd nodded, not understanding. "Not yet." At the funeral, my father gave the eulogy. He spoke for 11 minutes about the Brennan legacy, about tradition. He mentioned Garrett 4 times. He mentioned my mother once. He did not mention me at all. Afterward, in the reception line, a man I didn't recognize stepped forward. Silver-haired, wire-rimmed glasses with thin gold frames. He shook my hand gently. "Your grandmother was very proud of you," he said quietly. "I'll be in touch." Then he disappeared into the crowd. That man was Harold Caldwell, and he was holding the key to everything. That evening, 15 of us gathered at the family house on Hawthorne Street. My father sat at the head of the long oak table, sterling silver flatware gleaming in the candlelight, raised his glass, and announced, "Mom left everything to me to manage. I'll distribute assets to the right people based on capability." His eyes landed on me. "Complex things aren't really your area, Tori." Garrett nodded. His wife Meredith adjusted her pearl strand and said nothing. I set my fork down. "Dad, Grandma told me." My mother was confused at the end. He cut in. "Whatever she promised you, forget it." My mother stared at her plate. She never looked up. She never looked up. After dinner, I went upstairs to my old bedroom. The Frank Lloyd Wright poster I'd taped to the wall at 16 was still there, edges curling. I opened the nightstand drawer out of habit and found an envelope that hadn't been there before. Cream-colored stationery. My name in blue ink. Grandma's handwriting, shaky but deliberate. Inside were 2 things. A 2-page letter pressed so hard the words had left grooves in the paper. And a partial photocopy of a document headed, "Irrevocable Trust Agreement. Eleanor M. Brennan, Settler." Highlighted in yellow, a single line, "Beneficiary, Victoria Tori Brennan." I read the letter with tears on my face. "Tori, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and your father is already doing what I knew he would. The original trust is with my attorney, Harold Caldwell, Northwest 23rd Avenue, Portland. The copy I've left you is partial, enough for you to know I'm telling the truth, not enough to prove it alone. Don't show this to anyone. Not your father, not Garrett, not even your mother. I love Linda, but she will tell Richard. Wait until the right time, and Harold will know what to do. You are always my architect, Tori. The one who builds. Don't let them tear you down. All my love, Grandma." I pressed the letter against my chest. I drove back to Portland the next morning without saying goodbye. No one noticed. Or if they did, no one called. I looked up Harold Caldwell online. Small office on Northwest 23rd, solo practice, estate planning and trusts. The silver-haired man from the funeral. I hovered over the phone number. I didn't call. Not yet. Because there was a part of me, the part my father had trained since childhood, that whispered, what if Grandma really was confused? What if you call and find out the one person who believed in you was just a sick old woman who didn't know what she was signing? I wasn't ready to risk that. Not yet. 3 weeks later, while clearing my inbox, I found an email from Garrett forwarded to me by accident. Subject line: Trust Amendment Draft Petition. My stomach dropped. I clicked it open, scanned the first lines, and had to close the laptop for a client deadline. But I'd seen enough to know that whatever my father was planning had already started. 3 more weeks passed. Then my mother called. Dad wanted the whole family for Thanksgiving. He wanted to mend things. I almost laughed. My father had never mended a thing in his life. He broke things and told you it was your fault for being breakable. I said I'd think about it. Then I opened Garrett's accidentally forwarded email and read the whole chain. 7 messages spanning 2 weeks. Garrett had drafted a legal petition to change the beneficiary of Grandma Eleanor's trust. The grounds: financial incompetence of the named beneficiary, me. The petition argued I had a pattern of unstable career decisions, no significant assets, and outstanding educational debt inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility. My own brother had written that about me in legal language for a court filing. But the line that blurred my vision wasn't the legal jargon. It was the casual note Garrett had typed at the bottom: she won't fight it. She never fights anything. That's the beauty of it, Dad. I sat there for a long time. Then I screenshotted every message, uploaded them to my cloud drive, backed them up on a thumb drive, and called my mother back. Tell Dad I'll be there for Thanksgiving. I was going home. Not to mend anything. The next morning, I called Harold Caldwell's office. A receptionist answered. I gave my name. A pause. Then, Miss Brennan, Mr. Caldwell has been expecting your call. Can you come in today? 2 hours later, I sat across from him in a small office lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound legal volumes. He was the man from the funeral. Same silver hair, same gold-framed glasses, same measured calm. Your grandmother hired me 20 years ago, he said. 8 years ago, after a conversation that troubled her deeply, she asked me to create an irrevocable trust with you as the sole beneficiary. He slid a document across the desk. Thick cream paper, a notary's red seal from Oregon, signatures at the bottom. $620,000 in an educational trust managed by U.S. Bank. Irrevocable means your father, as trustee, cannot alter the beneficiary. Any petition to do so requires either your written consent or a court ruling based on evidence of the settler's mental incapacity at the time of signing. He paused. Your grandmother anticipated this. She had her physician perform a cognitive evaluation the same week she signed. She was fully competent. I exhaled. It was the first full breath I'd taken in weeks. There's more, Caldwell said. Your father filed a petition 3 weeks ago requesting a change of beneficiary, listing Garrett. He told the court he was unable to locate you. The old lawyer's jaw tightened. You and I both know that's not true. I showed him the email chain. He read it without expression, then looked up. This is evidence of deliberate breach of fiduciary duty. If you want to fight this, you have everything you need. I want to fight this. He nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, there's one more thing. Your grandmother also left you the cottage at Cannon Beach. It's included in the trust. I don't think your father knows. He never read the full document. I stared at him. The cedar cottage where Grandma had taken me every summer. Where we'd watched Haystack Rock turn gold at sunset. When do you want to use this? Caldwell asked. Thanksgiving, I said. He's invited 30 people. Caldwell studied me for a long moment, then gave a single slow nod. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I packed a small bag, one change of clothes, my camel wool coat bought secondhand from a consignment shop, a toothbrush, and a manila folder thick with notarized copies. The originals stayed with Caldwell. He held the master set in his office safe. The copies were for the family. I drove south through Amber Hills. The Brennan house appeared through the trees as it always had, white colonial facade, iron gate, the ancient oak standing guard. My mother met me at the door and hugged me a beat too long, the way she did when she wanted to say something but wouldn't. Upstairs, I slid the manila folder under the mattress. Then I went to the window and looked at the backyard garden, Grandma's peony beds, overgrown and gray, untended since she'd been too sick to kneel. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass and whispered, "I'm here, Grandma." Downstairs, my father didn't stand when I walked in. He looked at me from his leather chair and said, "Oh, you came." Garrett glanced at my coat, slightly pilled at the elbows, and said, "Still haven't upgraded, huh, Tor?" I smiled, sat down, said nothing. Thanksgiving morning, the house filled like a theater before a show. By noon, 32 people moved through every room, laughter and clinking glasses and children in the hallways. At 4 o'clock, we sat to eat. The long oak table seated 18. Overflow went to a folding table in the living room. I was placed at the folding table between my 9-year-old second cousin Oliver and an empty chair. My father stood at the head of the main table beneath the crystal chandelier and raised his glass of Pinot Noir. "This Thanksgiving is special," he said, courtroom voice filling the room. "We've lost Mom this year, but the Brennan family endures, and I'm proudest of my son Garrett, who just won the biggest case of his career." He turned to Garrett. "To you, son." Applause. Garrett accepted it with practiced modesty. From the folding table, my Aunt Margaret called out, "What about Tori? Any good news, sweetheart?" "Tori is still finding her way," my father said, not looking at me. "She's creative. Every family needs someone to remind the rest of us not to take a wrong turn. Right, Tori?" Polite laughter rolled across both tables. Oliver, the 9-year-old beside me, looked up and whispered, "Are you okay?" I nodded and handed him a bread roll. After the pie was half gone and the port was flowing, my father stood again. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be making an important family announcement regarding Mom's estate. I expect everyone to be present." He smiled, the smile of a man who has already decided the outcome. It's what Mom would have wanted. I excused myself to do the dishes. I stood at the sink scrubbing a roasting pan, suds to my elbows, while 32 people in the next room drank port and not one had offered to clear a single plate. Garrett appeared in the doorway, wine glass dangling from 2 fingers. "You should really thank Dad for letting you sit at the table, even if it was the kids' table." He chuckled at his own joke. I didn't turn around. I kept scrubbing. But something in me, some wire that had been pulled taut for 29 years, finally hummed. "Garrett," I said, quiet and steady. "Do you know what Grandma left me?" The silence behind me changed texture. His wine glass clinked against the counter. When I glanced over my shoulder, his face had gone very still. He left without a word. 10 minutes later, my father's voice thundered from the living room. "Tori, get in here now." I dried my hands and walked in. 32 faces stared at me. My father stood in the center of the room, pointing at me like I was a defendant. "You threatened your brother. You think you can manipulate this family." He didn't let me respond. "You are grounded. Go to your room." The room erupted in laughter. 32 people, most of them adults, laughing because Richard Brennan had just grounded his 29-year-old daughter like a misbehaving child. Aunt Margaret covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. Uncle Don snorted into his port. My mother sat in the corner chair, staring at her hands. Nobody said stop. Nobody said that's enough. I looked at my father. His watch caught the light as he jabbed a finger toward the staircase. "Go. Now." I held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then I said, in a voice so calm it surprised even me, "All right." I walked upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and called Harold Caldwell. It rang twice. He answered. "Mr. Caldwell," I said. "I need you to bring the originals tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. A pause. Then his steady voice, "I'll be there." I set my alarm for 4 a.m. and sat on the edge of the twin bed in the dark, listening to the laughter floating up through the floorboards, thinking, enjoy it. Because that is the last time. I left at 4:15. No drama, no slamming doors. I packed in the dark, slid the folder into my tote, and walked downstairs in socked feet. The only thing I left behind was the framed photo of Grandma Eleanor on the nightstand, face down. I drove to a 24-hour diner 3 miles from the house, ordered coffee I didn't drink, and waited for daylight. At 7:42, my phone lit up. A text from Garrett. "Where are you? Dad's looking for you." I didn't respond. Inside the house, my cousin Danny told me later, my father came downstairs at 7:30 in a pressed Oxford shirt, looking like a man about to chair a board meeting. Someone go wake Tori. She's got an apology to make. Nobody moved. Richard climbed the stairs himself, knocked twice, crisp, expectant, and opened the door. The bed was made. Closet open and empty. Drawers cleared. The room held nothing of me except the photograph of Grandma Eleanor, face down on the nightstand like a final punctuation mark. He stood in that doorway for a full 10 seconds before something shifted in his expression. He came downstairs slowly. "Tori's gone," he announced to the relatives still at breakfast. "She left in the middle of the night like a coward." Garrett looked up from his laptop and smiled. "Well, that settles it." "Exactly," my father said. Now, I was planning the estate announcement at 10, but since the only person who might object has run away. The doorbell rang. My mother opened it. On the front porch stood Harold Caldwell in a gray suit, leather briefcase in hand, expression like a storm front. "I'm Harold Caldwell," he said. "Attorney for Eleanor Brennan. I need to speak with the entire family. Right now." The dining room went quiet in stages, rippling table to table until even the children stopped fidgeting. Caldwell walked in the way a man walks into a courtroom, unhurried, deliberate, completely certain of his authority. He set his briefcase on the dining table and unclasped it without sitting down. His hands had a visible tremor. Not from nerves. From anger. My father rose from his chair. "Harold, you are not invited. This is my home." "This is the home Eleanor Brennan built with her family's money," Caldwell said. "I'm here because I have a legal obligation to the beneficiary of her trust. Tori has no rights. Tori is the sole named beneficiary of an irrevocable trust executed 8 years ago. You know this. You've known it since the day your mother signed it." The room was absolutely still. 30 pairs of eyes moved between the two men. "My mother was in cognitive decline," Richard said. "Whatever she signed was signed in the presence of 2 independent witnesses and accompanied by a physician's evaluation confirming full mental competency." Caldwell opened the briefcase and removed a folder. "Would you like me to read it aloud, Mr. Brennan?" "To everyone." Aunt Margaret leaned forward. Uncle Don put down his coffee. My father looked at the folder the way a man looks at a weapon pointed at his chest. Then he said very quietly, "Get out of my house." "Sir," Caldwell said, voice steady. "What have you done?" I said, "Get out." "You're trespassing." "I'll call the police." "You're welcome to. And when they arrive, I'll show them the petition you filed with the court 3 weeks ago, the one where you claimed you were unable to locate the beneficiary. The beneficiary whose phone number you have, whose address you have, who was sleeping in this house last night." Richard's face went red, then white, then a mottled gray. Around the room, I could hear the reaction spreading. Margaret pressing a hand to her mouth. Don's brow deepening. Cousins exchanging glances. Garrett stood, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Mr. Caldwell, any documents can be contested in the appropriate legal." "You drafted the petition, didn't you, Mr. Brennan?" Caldwell turned to face him, voice precise and surgical. "You prepared a filing to change the beneficiary of an irrevocable trust on behalf of your father, the trustee." "I have the emails." Garrett's composure didn't shatter. It evaporated. His eyes darted involuntarily to his father. "Dad," he said under his breath. "We need to talk privately." Richard didn't even look at him. "No, I have nothing to hide." Aunt Margaret stood up. Her voice carried the authority of a woman who had watched a family lie to itself for decades. "Richard," she said, "let the man speak." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, quiet, but present, like the first cracks in a frozen lake. My father looked around and saw perhaps for the first time that the audience he'd assembled for his own performance was no longer on his side. "This is absurd," he said. But his voice had lost its courtroom resonance. It sounded smaller, like tissue paper held to light. Caldwell was asked to leave and did, not in defeat, but with the measured certainty of a chess player who knows his next 3 moves. "I'll be back at 2 o'clock for the formal reading of Eleanor Brennan's estate, which you scheduled, Mr. Brennan. It's on your own calendar." He paused at the door. "And I won't be coming alone." The front door closed with a soft click. From a Stumptown coffee on Division Street, watching rain trace lines down my windshield, I sent a formal email to U.S. Bank's Trust Management Division requesting written confirmation of my beneficiary status. At 9:41, the reply came from Trust Officer Patricia Langley. I was the sole named beneficiary. The trust corpus of $620,000 remained intact. A petition to amend had been filed October 14th by Richard A. Brennan, but had not been approved by the court. No disbursements could be made without my written authorization. I printed a copy at FedEx 2 blocks away. Caldwell called at 11:15. He threw me out. Threatened the police. A pause, something close to dry amusement. 2 o'clock, Tori. Park on the next block. You go in first. I follow. Okay. Are you sure about this? Once it's done, there's no going back. I looked out at the rain. A woman walked past holding a little girl's hand, both of them splashing through puddles, laughing at nothing. I've been going back my whole life, Mr. Caldwell. Every holiday, every phone call, every time I swallowed something that should have made me spit. I'm done going back. Then I'll see you at 2. Inside the Brennan house, the morning had curdled. People were still talking, still picking at leftover pie, but the conversation had a new undercurrent, the kind of tension where everyone is discussing the weather and thinking about the earthquake. My mother told me later that Margaret had cornered her in the hallway. Linda, is Richard sure everything is in order? That lawyer didn't look like a man who was bluffing. My mother's eyes were rimmed red. I don't know, Margaret. Richard doesn't tell me about the finances. He never has. In his study, Richard was making phone calls, growing louder with each attempt. It was the Friday after Thanksgiving. Every attorney's office in Portland had their voicemail on. Richard Brennan, former state judge, could not reach a single lawyer. Garrett appeared in the doorway. Dad, maybe we should postpone the reading. I don't retreat, Richard said. Not from Caldwell, not from Tori, not from anyone. Garrett closed his mouth. He looked, Danny said, like a man who had just realized the lifeboat had a hole in it. At 12:30, I sat across from Caldwell in his office one last time. He walked me through 4 neat stacks on his desk. Stack 1, the original irrevocable trust, cream paper, notary seal, Eleanor's signature, steady, deliberate. Beside it, the physician's letter from Dr. Margulis confirming cognitive competency, date-stamped and countersigned. Stack 2, the email chain between Richard and Garrett, printed with full metadata, timestamps, sender addresses, routing information. She won't fight it, highlighted in yellow. Stack 3, Patricia Langley's letter from U.S. Bank, trust balance $620,000 intact. Stack 4, something I hadn't seen before. Caldwell slid it across the desk. A deed. The house on Hawthorne Street. The deed has been in Eleanor's name since 1981, he said. She purchased the property with her mother's inheritance before she married your grandfather. Richard never owned it. He assumed, as he assumes most things, that it was his by default. Under the terms of the trust, ownership transfers to the named beneficiary upon Eleanor's death. I stared at him. He doesn't know this. He never read the full trust document, Caldwell confirmed. He read the first 3 pages, the ones that named him trustee, and stopped. Of course he did. Richard Brennan had never needed to read the fine print. He was the fine print. I gathered the 4 stacks into my folder. We shook hands. His grip was firm, and behind those gold-framed glasses was something I hadn't seen from any adult in my family since my grandmother died. Trust. At 1:45, I drove down Hawthorne Street for the second time in 24 hours. The rain had stopped. A thin November sun turned the wet pavement into a mirror. I drove slowly, remembering. The sidewalk where Grandma had walked me to school. The front yard where she'd knelt beside me in the dirt. The secret, she'd said, pressing my small hand into the soil, is to take the whole root ball. You don't leave any part of yourself behind. My mother called. Tori, just come home and apologize. This can all be over. I'm coming home, Mom. But not to apologize. A silence. Then, very small, what are you going to do? The right thing. I hung up. I parked behind the house next to Caldwell's silver sedan. He was in the driver's seat, briefcase on his lap, reading glasses on. He glanced through the windshield and gave a single nod. I got out, camel coat, canvas tote with the folder inside. My hands were steady. The gate was open. From inside, I heard voices, 30 people assembled and waiting for Richard Brennan to tell them how the world was supposed to work. I slipped through the kitchen entrance and stood in the hallway just out of sight. Through the archway, my father had rearranged the living room. Chairs pulled from every room, all facing the fireplace like pews facing an altar. Richard stood before them in his pressed Oxford, reading glasses on. A single sheet of paper held the way judges hold verdicts, high enough to see, low enough to withhold. As you know, my mother's passing left certain matters to be settled. I've reviewed her wishes carefully and want to share the distribution plan she intended. The family trust will be consolidated under my management. The educational fund, $620,000, will be transferred to Garrett for stewardship of the next generation. He paused. As for Tori, a small, merciful smile, Mom wanted her to have a gesture of goodwill. $5,000. A few sympathetic nods. Meredith placed her hand on Garrett's arm. Garrett lowered his eyes in a performance of humility so polished it could have won an award. Any questions? From the hallway, I took a breath, pulled the manila folder from my tote, and stepped into the room. Behind me, the front door opened quietly. Harold Caldwell walked in. Every head turned. 32 faces, some surprised, some confused, a few genuinely pleased. Danny, sitting in the back row, gave me a small nod. Aunt Margaret straightened in her chair. My father's expression went through 3 phases in 2 seconds: surprise, annoyance, then the courtroom mask snapping back into place. The prodigal daughter returns. A few obligatory chuckles. I assumed you'd run off for good. Are you here to apologize to your brother? No, I said. My voice was level, calm in a way that surprised me, because my heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I was sure people could see it through my coat. I'm here to hear the will. The real one. I walked past him, past his pointed finger and his Cartier watch and the chair where he'd held court for 30 years, and set the manila folder on the table beside the fireplace. Caldwell stepped in behind me, briefcase, gray suit, the quiet authority of a man who had done this for decades. I turned to face the room, not my father, the room. I'm sorry to interrupt, but what my father just read is not my grandmother's will. It's a distribution plan he wrote himself. I placed my hand on the folder. This is the original irrevocable trust that Eleanor Brennan executed 8 years ago, filed with her attorney, Mr. Caldwell, and verified by U.S. Bank. My grandmother named one beneficiary. Me. Silence. Not polite silence. The absolute silence of a room full of people who have just realized they are witnessing something they cannot undo. My father's face drained of color, not gradually, all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. Aunt Margaret said clearly, "Let her speak." Caldwell opened his briefcase, removed the original trust, and held it up so the room could see the notary's red seal, bright as a stop sign against cream paper. He read, "The settler, Eleanor M. Brennan, establishes this irrevocable trust for the sole benefit of her granddaughter, Victoria Tori Brennan. Trust corpus, $620,000. Additionally, the real property at 4714 Hawthorne Street, Portland, Oregon, purchased in 1981, shall transfer to the beneficiary upon the settler's death." A gasp swept the room. Uncle Don leaned forward so far his chair creaked. Someone whispered, "She left her the house." Caldwell continued. As trustee, Richard A. Brennan was given administrative authority only. He was expressly prohibited from altering the beneficiary designation, dispersing funds without the beneficiary's written consent, or encumbering the real property in any way. He lowered the document. In the past 3 months, Mr. Brennan filed a petition to change the beneficiary to his son, Garrett, claiming he was unable to locate Miss Brennan. He also failed to notify her of the trust's existence after Eleanor's death, as required by Oregon law. He produced the email chain, yellow highlighting visible from across the room, and read aloud, "She won't fight it. She never fights anything. That's the beauty of it, Dad." The room turned to look at Garrett. He sat very still, hand frozen on Meredith's arm. His face had gone the color of ash. Meredith carefully extracted her arm from under his hand and folded both of hers in her lap. My father opened his mouth. "She was confused," he said, but the words came out threadbare. She didn't know what she was signing. Caldwell's response was immediate. "Your mother's physician conducted a cognitive evaluation the same week of signing. Eleanor Brennan scored in the 93rd percentile for her age group. She was sharper than most of the people in this room." From the back, Great Aunt Judith, 81 years old, Eleanor's younger sister, who had said almost nothing all weekend, spoke quietly. "Eleanor told me about the trust 8 years ago. She said Richard will try to take it, but I've made sure he can't." She paused. She knew. She always knew. My father looked at Judith, then at Margaret, then at the room of faces that were no longer looking at him with respect or even polite neutrality. They were looking at him the way you look at something discovered to be rotten underneath. He had assembled his own audience, and they had just become his jury. He turned on Garrett. The alliance they'd built over 33 years collapsed in a single sentence. "Say something. You're the lawyer. Contest it. Do something." Garrett spoke in a voice so low only the front row heard clearly. "Dad, irrevocable means irrevocable. You can't contest it. I told you that from the beginning. You said you'd handle it." My father's hand came down on the back of a dining chair with a crack that made the nearest cousins flinch. His knuckles went white around the wood. "You said she'd never find out." And there it was. In front of 30 witnesses, my father confirmed every detail Harold Caldwell had presented. The port glass slipped from his other hand and shattered on the hardwood. The dark red spread slowly toward the Persian rug, and nobody moved to clean it up. Then something shifted. The aggression drained, and in its place came something I had watched him use 1,000 times. He softened his voice. He lowered his shoulders. He turned to me with glistening eyes. "Tori, sweetheart. I was only trying to protect the family's assets. You're young. You don't have experience with this kind of money. I was doing this because I love you." I looked at him. The man who had called my career a joke. Who had seated me at the children's table. Who had grounded me at 29 in front of every relative I had. Who had told a court he couldn't find me when I was sleeping in his own house. I let the silence hold for 3 seconds. Then I said, "You didn't do this because you love me, Dad. You did this because you've never believed a daughter deserves the same as a son. And that's not love. That's control." My mother stood up. I hadn't noticed her crying, but her face was wet and her hands were trembling. She looked at my father, the man she'd been silent beside for 35 years, and said in a voice that shook but did not break, "You owe her an apology, Richard. You've owed her one her entire life." My father looked at my mother as though she had spoken in a language he didn't recognize. Then he looked at me. Then at the 30 faces watching him. He said nothing. He turned and walked into his study and closed the door. The room rearranged itself. Not the furniture, the people. The invisible lines of allegiance that had structured every Brennan gathering shifted quietly and permanently. Aunt Margaret reached me first. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like Chanel No. 5 and coffee. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you right now," she said close to my ear. Danny squeezed my shoulder. "I always knew you were the toughest one in this family." Garrett rose from the sofa. He didn't look at me. He took Meredith's arm and walked toward the front door. In the hallway, Meredith paused, unclasped her pearl strand, and dropped it into her coat pocket, as though wanting to make herself smaller, less visible, less associated. Caldwell organized his documents. "I'll file the petition to remove Mr. Brennan as trustee first thing Monday morning. The court process takes approximately 30 days. In the meantime, the trust is frozen." The Thanksgiving linen on the table was creased and stained with port wine. The Waterford crystal clock on the mantelpiece read 2:47. The whole thing had taken 47 minutes. 30 years of silence answered in 47 minutes. Monday morning, Caldwell filed 3 documents with Multnomah County Circuit Court. A petition to remove Richard A. Brennan as trustee, citing breach of fiduciary duty. A formal request to appoint Caldwell as interim trustee. And a complaint filed with the Oregon State Bar against Garrett R. Brennan for drafting a fraudulent petition to benefit an immediate family member while concealing a conflict of interest. Within 2 weeks, the court granted the trustee removal. Richard didn't contest it. His own attorney told him bluntly, "Irrevocable means irrevocable, Judge Brennan. And the email evidence is damning. If you fight this, you'll lose, and it'll cost you $60,000 to find that out." The $620,000 was transferred to an account in my name. The deed to 4714 Hawthorne Street was updated. My name replaced Eleanor's as owner. Garrett received a formal notice of bar investigation. The outcome took months, but its shape was clear: a 6-month suspension for ethical violations. His largest client dropped him within days. He transitioned quietly to corporate consulting. My father called me once, 3 days after the filing. He said, "You've destroyed this family." I said, "No, Dad. You did. I just brought the receipts." He hung up. I haven't heard from him since. 2 weeks after the court order, I drove to Hawthorne Street with a single brass key from Caldwell. "It's yours," he'd said simply, and for some reason, those 2 words undid me more than anything else had. I turned the key. The door opened onto the foyer, and the smell hit me first. Wood polish, old books, lavender sachets from every closet. The house was silent in a way I'd never experienced here. My father's presence had always been the dominant frequency, his voice filling every room, his opinions occupying every conversation. Without him, the house breathed differently. It breathed like something finally resting. I walked through each room. The living room where 30 people had watched my life change. The dining room with faint water rings still on the oak. The kitchen where I'd scrubbed a roasting pan alone while my family laughed. Upstairs, my bedroom, the poster, the twin bed. Grandma's master bedroom, her reading chair by the window, novels stacked beside it, a pair of glasses she'd never wear again. Then the garden. I stood at the back door and looked at what had been Eleanor Brennan's pride. Peony beds tangled and brown, the stone path she'd laid herself barely visible under dead leaves, the birdbath dry. I knelt and pressed my palms flat against the cold earth. "I'll fix it, Grandma," I said. "I'll bring it back." And I knew, with the certainty that only grief and love and good dirt under your fingernails can give you, that I would. 6 months later, spring had come to Portland, and the peonies were coming back. I'd spent the winter on my hands and knees in the garden, pruning and clearing and aerating soil that had gone sour from 2 years of neglect. The roots were deeper than I'd expected. They had survived the abandonment. They just needed someone to cut away the dead weight and let the light in. I knew the feeling. With the student loan gone, paid in full, $38,412, the most satisfying check I'd ever written, I leased a small studio in the Alberta Arts District. Brennan Landscape Design. My name on the door. I converted Richard's old study into a design studio. Replaced his legal volumes with plant identification guides, stacked the shelves with soil samples and seed catalogs. It felt right. It felt like rewriting. Danny came by on weekends to help with the garden. Aunt Margaret called every Sunday at 9. My mother came to visit on a Thursday in April, the first time she'd entered the house without Richard beside her. We didn't say much. We planted tulip bulbs along the front walk, side by side, and that was enough. My father rented an apartment across town. I heard through Margaret that he told friends I'd stolen the house, that Grandma had been manipulated, that the whole thing was Caldwell's fault. The story changed depending on the audience, but the ending was always the same. Richard Brennan was the victim. Some things, I suppose, are truly irrevocable. One morning in spring, I found an envelope on the front porch that hadn't been there the night before. No stamp, no return address. Just my name in handwriting almost as familiar as my grandmother's. I opened it. A single line. "I'm sorry I never stood up. I'm standing now. Mom." I folded the letter. I tucked it into my coat pocket right next to Grandma's, the cream-colored stationery with the blue ink and the words that had saved my life. 2 letters, 2 women. One who planned 8 years ahead. One who finally caught up. I walked back into my house. The house my grandmother built, the house my father lost, the house that was always meant for someone who would take care of it. I closed the door. And for the first time in 29 years, it felt like coming home. Here is what I know now. Silence isn't agreement. I spent 29 years being quiet at the dinner table, and the people around me took that silence and called it consent. It wasn't. It was just a woman who hadn't found her evidence yet. Waiting isn't weakness. My father and my brother counted on my passivity. They were almost right. What they didn't account for is the difference between someone who can't fight and someone who is choosing when to. And the last thing, the thing that matters most, my grandmother didn't leave me money. She left me proof. Proof that someone in my family saw me, the real me, the one who builds things, and decided I was worth protecting. Not with words. With documents. With plans. With the kind of love that hires a lawyer and thinks 8 years ahead. That's the inheritance that changed my life. Not the $620,000, not the houses. The knowledge that I was worth the trouble. I still have the Frank Lloyd Wright poster. It's on the wall of my studio now, behind my drafting table, edges still curling. I look at it every morning and think about the girl who taped it up at 16, who wanted to build beautiful things and was told that wasn't enough. She was enough. She was always enough. She just needed the paperwork to prove it.